The autumn of 1884 brought an unusual chill to Millbrook, Colorado, a mining town perched precariously between the Rocky Mountain foothills and the endless prairie beyond. Emma Catherine Whitmore had grown accustomed to the rhythm of isolation that defined her life there. The morning rounds to check on elderly miners suffering from lung ailments, the afternoon hours spent cataloging medicinal herbs in her small clinic, and the evening silence that stretched across her modest home like a familiar blanket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Emma possessed the kind of practical beauty that frontier life demanded: strong hands that never trembled during surgery, clear blue eyes that could assess a patient's condition in seconds, and auburn hair she kept pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had learned that vanity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her father, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, had trained her in medicine before his death 3 years prior, leaving her as the only qualified healer for 50 miles in any direction. The people of Millbrook had initially resisted a woman doctor, but necessity had a way of overcoming prejudice. When old Pete Morrison nearly died from a mining accident and Emma's steady hands saved his life, the town's attitude shifted from skepticism to grudging acceptance. When she successfully delivered the banker's wife's difficult twins during a blizzard, acceptance became respect. By now, she was simply part of the town's fabric, the woman you went to when life took a dangerous turn. Her clinic occupied the ground floor of a 2-story wooden building on Main Street, with her living quarters upstairs. The waiting room held 6 chairs, usually occupied by miners with various ailments, ranchers' wives seeking remedies for their children, and occasionally travelers passing through who needed medical attention. The examination room was spartanly furnished, but impeccably clean, equipped with everything her father had taught her to use: surgical instruments, bottles of laudanum and morphine, rolls of clean bandages, and shelves lined with jars of herbs. She gathered herself from the surrounding mountains. Emma's routine rarely varied. She rose at dawn, checked on any patients who might have stayed overnight in the 2 small recovery rooms, prepared for the day's appointments, and spent her evenings updating patient records and studying the medical journals that arrived monthly from Denver. It was a solitary life, but one that gave her purpose and independence, 2 things she valued more than the companionship that seemed to elude her in this rough frontier town. The morning that would change everything began like any other. Emma was grinding willow bark for fever medication when Mrs. Henderson burst through the clinic door, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "Dr. Whitmore," she gasped, using the title Emma had earned through competence rather than formal education. "There's been trouble at the Garrett Ranch. Armed men rode through last night, took horses and supplies. Tom Garrett's been shot." Emma immediately began gathering her surgical kit. The Garrett Ranch lay 15 miles north, close enough to town to matter, far enough to make the ride dangerous if hostile riders were still in the area. "How bad is he hurt?" "Don't know. His boy rode in this morning, said his pa was bleeding bad but still breathing. The sheriff's organizing a posse, but they're more interested in chasing the outlaws than helping Tom." This wasn't unusual. Sheriff Coleman was a political appointment who spent more time worrying about his reputation than protecting the people he was supposed to serve. Emma had clashed with him before over his tendency to prioritize property crimes over human welfare. "Tell young Garrett I'll be there within the hour," Emma said, checking her supplies. "And Mrs. Henderson, if anyone asks, I'm treating a patient, nothing more." The older woman nodded knowingly. In a town where gossip traveled faster than horses, Emma had learned to be careful about her movements. Too much attention from the wrong people could complicate her work. As Emma prepared for the journey, she reflected on the growing tension that had been building around Millbrook for months. Reports of outlaw activity had increased dramatically since spring. The Morrison gang, led by three brothers whose names were whispered with equal parts fear and fascination, had been hitting ranches and small towns throughout the territory. Unlike common thieves, they seemed to follow a code. They took what they needed but rarely killed unless threatened, and they were known to leave money for poor families whose supplies they requisitioned. This Robin Hood approach had created a strange dynamic in the region. While law enforcement and wealthy ranchers wanted the Morrison brothers captured or killed, many common folk saw them as men driven to desperation by circumstances beyond their control. The territory was in economic turmoil, with mining companies and cattle barons consolidating power, while small farmers and independent miners struggled to survive. In such times, the line between outlaw and folk hero could become uncomfortably thin. Emma saddled her horse, a reliable mare named Duchess, and set out for the Garrett Ranch under an overcast sky that promised rain before evening. The ride gave her time to think about the moral complexities of frontier life that she encountered daily. As a healer, she had taken an informal oath to help anyone who needed medical attention, regardless of their circumstances or past actions. But living in a territory where justice was often a matter of who had the most guns or the best connections, she sometimes wondered if strict neutrality was always the right choice. The Garrett Ranch consisted of a modest house, a barn, and several outbuildings scattered across a valley that provided good grazing for cattle. Emma could see signs of the previous night's violence immediately: broken fence rails, scattered belongings, and the nervous energy of people who had experienced a trauma. Young Billy Garrett, perhaps 16 years old, met her at the gate. "Thank God you came, Dr. Whitmore. Pa's in the house. Ma's with him, but she's mighty scared." Emma followed Billy inside, where she found Tom Garrett lying on his bed, his wife Sarah holding his hand while trying to control her own trembling. The rancher had been shot in the shoulder, the bullet passing through cleanly, but causing significant blood loss. More concerning was the greyish pallor of his skin and the shallow, rapid breathing that indicated shock. "Mr. Garrett," Emma said, gently, setting down her bag and beginning her examination, "I'm going to take care of this. You're going to be fine." As she worked, cleaning the wound, checking for signs of infection, administering morphine for the pain, she listened to the family's account of the attack. 3 men had ridden up just before sunset, asking for food and fresh horses. Tom had tried to refuse, knowing they were likely the outlaws everyone was talking about, but he hadn't drawn his gun quickly enough. The leader, described as tall, with dark hair and unusually polite mannerisms, had insisted they only wanted supplies and would pay for what they took. "But Pa got spooked," Billy explained. "Thought they might hurt Ma, so he went for his rifle. That's when the shooting started." "The strange thing," Sarah Garrett added, "was that after Tom went down, the leader seemed genuinely upset. He kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen that way, that they weren't killers. He even left extra money on the table before they rode off." Emma filed this information away while focusing on her medical work. The bullet wound itself was straightforward, but Tom had lost considerable blood, and his body was struggling to recover. She would need to monitor him closely for the next several hours to ensure he didn't slip into a deeper state of shock. As she worked, Emma became aware of a growing commotion outside. Horses approaching, men's voices raised in excitement and anger. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Coleman arriving with his posse, 8 men armed with rifles and the kind of righteous fury that often led to poor decisions. "Mrs. Garrett," Emma said quietly, "I need you to keep pressure on this bandage while I speak with the sheriff. Don't let anyone disturb your husband. He needs rest more than questions right now." Outside, she found Coleman interrogating Billy. Garrett, with the aggressive persistence of a man more interested in appearing important than gathering useful information. The sheriff was a political creature who had campaigned on promises to bring law and order to the territory, but his actual experience with dangerous criminals was limited. "Sheriff," Emma interrupted, Mr. Garrett needs medical attention, not an interrogation. He's lost significant blood and is in shock. Your questions can wait." Coleman turned on her with the patronizing smile he reserved for women who dared to challenge his authority. "Now, Dr. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern for Tom, but we've got outlaws to catch. The Morrison gang has been terrorizing this territory for months, and this is our best chance to track them down." "Your best chance," Emma replied evenly, "is to let me stabilize my patient so he can give you a coherent account of what happened. Right now, he's barely conscious." The confrontation might have escalated, but one of the posse members, a rancher named Frank Morrison, no relation to the Outlaw family, stepped forward. "Sheriff, the doc's right. Tom's in no shape to talk. Why don't we scout the area, see which direction they headed? The trail's still fresh." Coleman reluctantly agreed, but Emma could see the calculation in his eyes. He was facing pressure from territorial authorities to show results against the outlaw problem, and political pressure often led to shortcuts that put innocent people at risk. After the posse departed to search for tracks, Emma returned to her patient. Tom Garrett's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he would need careful monitoring through the night. As she prepared to settle in for a long vigil, she reflected on the strange moral landscape of frontier life that seemed to grow more complex with each passing month. The Morrison brothers weren't common criminals. That much was clear from every account she'd heard. They seemed to be men driven by circumstances she didn't fully understand, operating according to a code that distinguished them from the brutal outlaws who plagued other parts of the territory. Yet they were still outlaws, still men who lived by violence when necessary, still a threat to the fragile peace that places like Millbrook depended on. Emma had always prided herself on her ability to remain neutral in the political and social conflicts that swirled around frontier communities. Her job was to heal, not to judge. But as she sat beside Tom Garrett's bed, listening to the wind beginning to pick up outside and watching the first drops of rain streak the windows, she sensed that her comfortable neutrality was about to be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The autumn storm that was approaching Millbrook carried more than rain clouds. It carried the kind of change that would force everyone in its path to examine their assumptions about right and wrong, about justice and mercy, about the sometimes narrow line between civilization and chaos. Emma pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and settled into the chair beside her patient's bed. Outside, the wind howled with increasing intensity, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch house, dangerous men rode paths that would soon intersect with her own in ways she could never have anticipated. The comfortable predictability of her life was about to end, though she didn't know it yet. The storm was coming, and with it, choices that would test every principle she held dear and transform her understanding of what it meant to heal in a world where the lines between hero and villain were often drawn in shifting sand. As rain began to patter against the windows, and Tom Garrett stirred restlessly in his medicated sleep, Emma Catherine Whitmore sat in peaceful ignorance of the fact that her greatest challenge and her greatest opportunity was riding toward her through the storm-dark night. The hours passed slowly in the Garrett house. Emma maintained her vigil, checking Tom's pulse regularly and adjusting his bandages as needed. Sarah Garrett dozed fitfully in a chair across the room, while Billy kept watch by the window, his young face etched with worry and the premature seriousness that frontier life imposed on children too early. Around midnight, Tom's fever spiked. Emma had been expecting this. The body's natural response to trauma and blood loss often manifested in the hours following treatment. She applied cool cloths to his forehead and administered willow bark tea, a remedy her father had taught her. That often proved more effective than the expensive medicines shipped from the back east. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Will he be all right?" Sarah whispered, reaching for her husband's hand. "The fever is normal," Emma assured her. "His body is fighting to heal itself. The wound is clean, no signs of infection yet. If we can keep the fever manageable through the night, he should recover fully." But even as she spoke these reassuring words, Emma's mind was elsewhere, troubled by thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. Something about the Garrett family's description of the attack bothered her. The leader's apparent remorse, the extra money left behind, the emphasis on taking only what they needed. It painted a picture of men driven by desperation rather than greed. She had seen genuine criminals in her 3 years of practice. Men who hurt others for pleasure, who took what they wanted without regard for the consequences. The Morrison brothers didn't seem to fit that pattern, yet they were still outlaws, still dangerous, still outside the law that held frontier communities. Together, the rain intensified as the night wore on, drumming against the roof with increasing urgency. Emma found herself listening for sounds beyond the storm. Hoofbeats, shouts, the crack of gunfire that might indicate the sheriff's posse had found their quarry. But the night remained quiet except for the weather. Around 3 in the morning, she heard something that made her freeze. Not the sound of horses or men, but something more subtle, the creak of a floorboard on the front porch, barely audible above the rain. Emma's hand instinctively moved to the small pistol she carried in her medical bag. A precaution her father had insisted upon for a woman traveling alone in dangerous territory. Billy had heard it too. The young man was already moving toward his rifle, which leaned against the wall near the door. Emma motioned for him to wait, her medical training having taught her the value of gathering information before acting. The sound came again, followed by a soft knock on the door. Not the aggressive pounding of law enforcement or the demanding rap of criminals, but the hesitant tap of someone seeking help rather than imposing authority. "Who's there?" Billy called out, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "Someone." "Who needs a doctor?" came the reply. The voice was male, young, and carried an unmistakable note of desperation. "Please, my brother's dying." Emma's medical instincts warred with her survival instincts. Everything about the situation screamed potential danger. A stranger at the door in the middle of a storm, the mention of a brother who might be one of the outlaws, the possibility that this was a trap designed to capture the doctor who had been treating their victim. But the voice carried something else too. Genuine fear. Real anguish. The kind of raw emotion that was difficult to fake and impossible for a healer to ignore. Sarah Garrett had awakened at the voices and was looking at Emma with wide, frightened eyes. Billy kept his rifle ready but looked to the doctor for guidance. The decision fell to her, and she realized that this moment, whatever it led to, would define not just the immediate situation but possibly her entire future. "How do I know you're not here to hurt this family?" Emma called through the door. "Because we're not killers, ma'am. What happened here today, the shooting, that was an accident. We just needed supplies. Nobody was supposed to get hurt." The voice paused, and Emma could hear the strain in it. "My brother Joshua, he's been shot. Real bad. He's going to die. Without help, and you're the only doctor for 50 miles. Emma closed her eyes, weighing her options. If this was one of the Morrison brothers, helping him would make her complicit in their crimes. If she refused and a man died who could have been saved, she would be violating everything her father had taught her about the sacred duty of healing. "Ma'am," the voice continued, "I know what you're thinking. We're outlaws. We're dangerous. Maybe we deserve whatever happens to us. But Joshua, he's got a wife, little children. Please, I'm begging you." The mention of a family struck Emma deeply. She thought of the wives and children she had treated over the years, the desperate parents who had brought sick children to her. Adieu, the human connections that transcended the artificial boundaries of law and social order. "Billy," she said quietly, "I need you to make a choice. I can't force this on your family. If I go with this man, there could be consequences. The sheriff might blame you for harboring fugitives. Your father might not want that kind of trouble." The young man looked at his sleeping father, then at his mother, then back at Emma. "Doc, you saved my pa's life tonight. You've been nothing but good to this family. If you think you need to help this man's brother, then we'll stand by you." Sarah Garrett nodded her agreement, though fear was written clearly across her features. Dr. Whitmore has never turned away anyone who needed healing. We won't ask her to start now. Emma felt a surge of gratitude toward this family who were willing to risk their own safety to support her medical calling. She moved to the door, her hand still on her pistol, and slowly opened it. The man on the porch was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair plastered to his head by the rain and clothes that marked him as someone who lived rough. But his eyes held the kind of anguish that couldn't be manufactured. This was a man watching someone he loved die, and that transcended whatever crimes he might have committed. "I'm Dr. Whitmore," she said. "Where is your brother?" "About 2 miles north in an old line shack near Fletcher's Creek. He took a bullet in the chest 3 days ago. We tried to treat it ourselves, but—" He shook his head helplessly. "He's burning up with fever, can't keep water down. The wound, it's gone bad." Emma's medical mind immediately began cataloguing the likely complications: infection, sepsis, possible internal bleeding. 3 days with an untreated chest wound in frontier conditions would be challenging for even a healthy man to survive. "I'll need to get my supplies," she said, "and I'll need guarantees about my safety. You have my word, ma'am, our word. We're not the kind of men who hurt healers." As Emma gathered her equipment, adding extra supplies for what would likely be major surgery under primitive conditions, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 3 years ago, she had been the daughter of a respected doctor in a stable community. Now, she was about to ride into the storm to treat a wounded outlaw, trusting her life to the word of men society had branded as criminals. But she had learned something important during her years of frontier practice. Humanity existed in the most unlikely places, and healing transcended the artificial boundaries that society imposed. Her father had once told her that a true doctor served the oath of healing before any other loyalty, and that sometimes that service required courage that went beyond medical skill. "Billy," she said, "if I'm not back by dawn, tell Sheriff Coleman what happened. Tell him I went willingly, that no one forced me. And tell him that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." The young man standing on the porch listened to this exchange with what appeared to be growing respect. When Emma emerged with her medical bag and a satchel of additional supplies, he helped her saddle a fresh horse from the Garrett stable. "Ma'am," he said as they prepared to ride into the storm, "I want you to know, whatever happens tonight, you're doing something good. Joshua's a good man. He's made some bad choices, but he's not evil. None of us are evil, just trying to survive in a world that doesn't seem to have much place for people like us." As they rode away from the Garrett ranch, Emma found herself entering a realm she had never imagined, a world where the clear distinctions between right and wrong became blurred, where survival sometimes required choices that civilization couldn't accommodate, where healing became an act of faith that transcended law and social order. The storm intensified around them as they rode through the darkness, and Emma realized that she was not just traveling through physical weather, but through a moral landscape that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, mercy, and the true meaning of healing in a world where simple answers rarely existed. The ride through the storm tested every skill Emma had learned about navigating treacherous mountain terrain in darkness. Her guide, who had introduced himself simply as Nathan, led them along paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. Rain lashed their faces with stinging intensity, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark moments that revealed just how precarious their route had become. "How much farther?" Emma called over the wind, her medical bag secured tightly against her body to protect the delicate instruments within. "Half a mile," Nathan replied, his voice strained with exhaustion and worry. "The shack's in a hollow by the creek. We've been holed up there since the shooting at Patterson's Place." Patterson's Place. Emma knew it, a remote trading post that served travelers heading west. If the Morrison brothers had been involved in trouble there, it explained why Nathan's brother Joshua was wounded and why they were hiding in such an isolated location. As they descended into the hollow, Emma could see a faint light flickering through the trees. The line shack was little more than a crude shelter, built years ago for cowboys working the distant ranges. That such a structure was being used as a refuge by wounded outlaws spoke to the desperation of their situation. Two horses stood tethered under a lean-to beside the shack, their heads hanging low against the storm. Nathan dismounted and helped Emma down, his movements quick but careful. "Ma'am, before we go in, there's something you need to know. My brothers, they might not take kindly to bringing a stranger here. They're protective, and they're scared. Don't take anything they say personal." Emma nodded, understanding that fear and desperation could make even good men dangerous. As they approached the door, she could hear voices from within, one low and urgent, another weak and intermittent. Nathan knocked in a specific pattern before opening the door. "It's me. I brought the doctor." The scene that greeted Emma challenged every preconception she had harbored about outlaws and their way of life. The interior of the shack was surprisingly clean and organized. Medical supplies, clearly stolen but carefully maintained, were arranged on a makeshift table. The wounded man lay on a bedroll near the fireplace, covered with clean blankets. Standing over him was another man, tall and broad-shouldered, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. But what struck Emma most forcefully was the tenderness in the older man's movements as he adjusted his wounded brother's pillow, the gentleness in his voice as he murmured reassurances. This was not the brutal criminal she had expected to encounter. "Joshua, the doctor's here," Nathan said, moving to his wounded brother's side. "She's going to help you." The man on the bedroll tried to focus his fever-bright eyes on Emma. Joshua Morrison was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and features that would have been handsome if not distorted by pain and illness. His skin had the greyish pallor that indicated systemic infection, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. The older brother, who could only be the famous leader of the Morrison gang, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "I'm Caleb Morrison," he said, his voice carrying authority despite the circumstances. "I appreciate you coming, Doc, but I need to know, are you here to help, or are you here to gather information for the law?" Emma met his gaze directly. "I'm here because your brother is dying, and I took an oath to heal whoever needs healing. Nothing more, nothing less." Caleb studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Nathan said you were different. Most folks around here, they see us as animals. Shoot first, ask questions later." "I see a man who needs medical attention," Emma replied, setting down her bag and moving toward Joshua. "Everything else is secondary." She began her examination. Emma became aware of the complex dynamics at play in this small shelter. Caleb Morrison moved with the quiet authority of a natural leader, but his concern for his wounded brother was evident in every gesture. Nathan hovered nearby, his young face etched with worry. And on the bedroll, Joshua drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words that sounded like a woman's name. The wound itself was worse than Emma had hoped, but not beyond saving. The bullet had entered Joshua's chest, just below. The collarbone, missing vital organs, but creating significant tissue damage. More problematically, the wound showed clear signs of infection that had spread throughout his system. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, beginning to lay out her surgical instruments. "Fever started yesterday," Caleb replied. "Before that, he was hurting but alert. We tried to clean the wound, but we don't know much about doctoring." Emma examined their makeshift medical supplies with growing respect. The brothers had somehow acquired proper bandages, antiseptic solutions, even a bottle of morphine. "Where did you get these supplies?" "Patterson had a well-stocked medical kit," Nathan admitted. "We took it when we left his place." "Was Patterson hurt in the shooting?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Patterson's fine. He drew on us when we asked to buy supplies. We defended ourselves. Nobody died, if that's what you're asking." Emma filed this information away while focusing on the immediate medical crisis. Joshua's life hung in the balance, and philosophical questions about the brothers' criminal activities would have to wait. "I need to remove the bullet and clean the wound thoroughly," she explained. "The infection is spreading. Without surgery, he'll be dead by morning." "What do you need from us?" Caleb asked. "Hot water, clean cloth, and absolute stillness while I work. This is going to be delicate." As Nathan built up the fire and Caleb heated water in a large pot, Emma prepared for surgery under conditions that would have challenged even her father's considerable skills. The light was poor, the workspace cramped, and her patient was weakened by days of fever and infection. But she had advantages that most frontier doctors lacked. Her father had insisted on teaching her the latest surgical techniques from European medical schools, and her 3 years of practice had given her experience with gunshot wounds that few physicians possessed. "I'm going to need both of you to hold him steady," she instructed as she prepared to make the initial incision. "The morphine will help with the pain, but he's likely to thrash when I start cutting." What followed was perhaps the most challenging surgery of Emma's career. Working by firelight and oil lamp, she carefully reopened the wound, cleaning away infected tissue and searching for bullet fragments. Joshua's breathing remained steady under the morphine, but his fever continued to rage. As she worked, Emma became increasingly aware of the story this wound told. The bullet had been fired from close range, but at an upward angle, suggesting that Joshua had been shot while defending himself rather than attacking. Combined with Caleb's account of events at Patterson's trading post, it painted a picture of men who used violence defensively rather than aggressively. "There," she said finally, extracting the last piece of lead from the wound. "The bullet's out, and I've cleaned away the worst of the infected tissue. Now we wait and see if his body can fight off the remaining infection." As she sutured the wound with practiced precision, Caleb spoke quietly from across the small room. "Doc, I want you to know, we're not the men the newspapers make us out to be. We take what we need to survive, but we don't hurt innocent people. What happened to the rancher today, that was an accident. My brother Nathan, he's young and got spooked when the man went for his gun." "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked, not looking up from her work. "Because you risked your life to come here. Because you're treating Joshua like he matters, not like he's just another criminal. Because maybe you're the first person in a long time who's seen us as human beings instead of animals to be hunted." Emma finished the suturing and began bandaging the wound. "What made you choose this life? You don't seem like common thieves." Caleb was quiet for so long that Emma thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice heavy with old pain, he began to speak. "We had a farm, Joshua, Nathan and me. Good land about 30 miles south of here. Worked it for 8 years, built it into something we could be proud of. Then the railroad came through, and the cattle barons decided they wanted our water rights. He paused, staring into the fire. They made us an offer that wasn't really an offer. Sell to them for half what the land was worth, or watch our crops get trampled and our water poisoned. When we refused, they sent men to burn us out. Nathan picked up the story. Caleb tried the legal route, went to the territorial courts, filed papers, hired a lawyer. But the judge was in the cattle company's pocket. They ruled that our deed was invalid, some technicality about the original survey. "So you became outlaws," Emma said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. "We became what we had to become to survive," Caleb replied. "The law failed us, so we learned to live outside it. We take from those who stole from us, and we help those who can't help themselves." Emma absorbed this information while monitoring Joshua's condition. His fever seemed to be breaking slightly, and his breathing had improved since the surgery. But he remained critically ill, requiring constant attention through the night. "There's something else you should know," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Joshua's wife, she's expecting their first child. She's staying with her sister in Denver, waiting for us to find a way to go legitimate again." The mention of a pregnant wife waiting for news of her husband struck Emma with unexpected force. She thought of the children she had delivered, the families she had helped bring together, the fundamental human bonds that transcended legal and social boundaries. "What's her name?" she asked. "Rebecca," Joshua said weakly, his eyes opening for the first time since the surgery. "Rebecca Ann Morrison, prettiest girl in Colorado Territory." Emma smiled at the pride in his voice despite his weakness. "She sounds lovely. You need to get better so you can see your child born." Joshua managed a weak nod before drifting back into medicated sleep. But Emma had seen something in his eyes, a fierce determination to survive, to return to the woman he loved, to build a life beyond the violence that had consumed his recent years. As the night wore on, Emma found herself engaged in the kind of intimate conversation that arose naturally in situations of shared crisis. Caleb spoke of his hopes for his brothers' futures, his regret over the path they had been forced to take, his dreams of someday finding a way back to legitimate life. Nathan talked about his education. He had attended a territorial college for 2 years before their family's troubles began, and his desire to use his skills for something more constructive than running from the law. "What would you do if you could start over?" Emma asked during one of the quiet moments between checking Joshua's bandages. "Teach, maybe," Nathan replied. "I always liked working with numbers, solving problems. Before all this started, I thought about becoming an engineer." "And you, Caleb?" The older brother was quiet for a long moment. "I'd like to raise horses, good horses, trained proper. Before the railroad troubles, I was getting a reputation for breeding the finest stock in the territory." Emma listened to these modest ambitions with growing understanding. These were not men who had chosen criminality from greed or natural violence. They were men who had been pushed outside the boundaries of legal society by circumstances beyond their control, yet they retained hopes and dreams that were fundamentally decent. As dawn approached, Joshua's condition began to improve noticeably. His fever broke completely, and he was able to keep down small amounts of water. The infection that had threatened his life was retreating before the combination of surgical intervention and his own body's healing response. "He's going to live," Emma announced, as golden light began filtering through the shack's single window. "The surgery was successful, and his body is responding well to treatment." The relief on Caleb's and Nathan's faces was profound. These hardened outlaws embraced each other with tears in their eyes, their joy at their brother's recovery overriding any concern for maintaining tough facades. "Doc," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my brother's life. You can thank me by making sure he gets proper rest and clean food for the next few weeks." Emma replied, packing her instruments, and by keeping those bandages dry and changed regularly. As she prepared to leave, Emma realized that the night's experience had fundamentally altered her understanding of justice and morality in frontier society. The Morrison brothers were criminals, yes, but they were also victims of a system that protected wealth and power at the expense of common people trying to build honest lives. Dr. Whitmore, Nathan said as she gathered her supplies, "There's something you need to know. Sheriff Coleman and his posse, they're not just looking to arrest us. Word is they've been authorized to bring us back dead or alive, and the cattle barons are offering a substantial reward." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that helping us might have put you in danger," Caleb explained. "If Coleman finds out you treated Joshua, he might decide you're an accomplice. The law doesn't always make fine distinctions about who's guilty and who's just trying to do right." The implications of this warning hit Emma with full force. By choosing to heal Joshua Morrison, she had crossed a line that society might not forgive. Her reputation, her practice, her entire life in Millbrook could be at risk if word of this night's work reached the wrong ears. But as she looked at Joshua, now sleeping peacefully with color returning to his cheeks, and at his brothers, whose gratitude and obvious love for each other had touched something deep in her heart, Emma realized that she regretted nothing about her choice. "I'm a doctor," she said simply. "I heal people who need healing. Let society make of that what it will." As she mounted her horse for the return journey to the Garrett Ranch, Emma carried with her more than medical supplies and the satisfaction of a successful surgery. She carried the beginning of a new understanding about the complexity of justice in a world where good and evil were rarely as clear-cut as law and society pretended. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and glistening in the early morning sun. But Emma knew that the real storm, the one that would test her principles and challenge her place in the community she had served faithfully for 3 years, was just beginning. Behind her, in a simple line shack by Fletcher's Creek, 3 brothers, who had been branded as criminals, shared a breakfast and planned for a future that might, for the first time in months, include hope for something better than mere survival. The catalyst moment had passed. Emma Catherine Whitmore had made her choice, crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. What lay ahead remained to be written, but it would be written by a woman who had learned that sometimes the most important moral choices came not in moments of clarity, but in moments of profound ambiguity, where courage meant acting on principle. Despite uncertain consequences, the sun climbed higher as she rode toward town, and with it came the realization that her comfortable life as Millbrook's respected doctor was about to become far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Emma arrived back at the Garrett Ranch as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the wet landscape in shades of gold and amber. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair had escaped its pins hours ago, and exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like a physical burden. But Joshua Morrison was alive, and that knowledge sustained her through the bone-deep weariness that followed. A night of life and death surgery. Tom Garrett was awake when she entered the house, his color much improved and his eyes clear. Sarah immediately rose from her chair, concern written across her features as she took in Emma's bedraggled appearance. "Dr. Whitmore, thank heavens you're back safe. We've been worried sick. Billy's been watching the road since before dawn." Emma managed a tired smile as she set down her medical bag. "The surgery went well. The patient will recover fully with proper care and rest." She deliberately kept her language vague, aware that the fewer details the Garrett family knew about her night's activities, the safer they would be if questions arose later. Tom Garrett, despite his own condition, seemed to understand the delicacy of the situation. "Doc, we're grateful for what you did for us yesterday, and we don't need to know anything about where you went last night." Some things are better left unspoken. Emma felt a surge of gratitude for this family's discretion and loyalty. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the quiet morning. Through the window, she could see Sheriff Coleman and his posse returning, their faces grim with failure and fatigue. "Billy," Emma said quietly, "help me change your father's bandages. We need to look like we've been here all night." The young man understood immediately, gathering fresh bandages, while Emma began examining Tom's wound with exaggerated attention. When Sheriff Coleman knocked on the door moments later, he found what appeared to be a routine medical consultation in progress. "Morning, Doc," Coleman said, removing his hat as he entered. His eyes were bloodshot from the sleepless night, and mud caked his boots and trousers. "How's Tom doing?" "Much better, Sheriff. The wound is healing cleanly, no signs of infection. He should be back on his feet within a week." Coleman nodded. Absently, his attention clearly elsewhere. Good. Listen, Doc, we tracked those outlaws most of the night, but the storm washed out their trail about 5 miles north of here. You didn't see or hear anything unusual during the night, did you?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "Nothing beyond the storm, Sheriff. I've been focused on my patient." It was technically the truth, though she was acutely aware of the layers of deception beneath her words. Coleman seemed to accept her statement, but something in his expression suggested a lingering suspicion. "Well, if you hear anything at all, you send word immediately. These Morrison brothers are dangerous men, and they won't hesitate to hurt innocent folks to protect themselves." After the sheriff and his posse departed, Emma remained at the Garrett Ranch for another hour, genuinely monitoring Tom's recovery, but also needing time to process the night's events. As she finally prepared to return to town, Sarah Garrett pulled her aside. "Dr. Whitmore, I don't know what you did last night, and I don't need to know, but I can see it weighs on you. Whatever choice you made it for the right reasons. That's the kind of person you are." The ride back to Millbrook gave Emma time to consider the implications of her decision. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, aligning herself with men society considered criminals. Yet she felt no regret, only a growing sense that the moral landscape of the frontier was far more complex than she had previously understood. Her clinic awaited her return, with its familiar routines and comforting predictability. But as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, Emma realized that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The examining room, the surgical instruments, the bottles of medicine, all of it now carried the weight of choices that extended far beyond simple medical practice. Mrs. Henderson was waiting on the front porch when Emma arrived, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. "Dr. Whitmore, thank goodness you're back. We heard about the trouble at Garrett Place. Is Tom going to be all right?" "He'll recover fully," Emma assured her, unlocking the clinic door. "What can I help you with this morning?" "It's my grandson, little Timothy. He's been running a fever for 2 days now, and his mother's beside herself with worry." Emma immediately shifted into her professional mode, grateful for the familiar rhythm of diagnosing and treating routine ailments. Timothy Henderson was suffering from a common childhood fever that would respond well to rest and proper hydration. As she prepared a bottle of fever-reducing medication, Emma found comfort in the straightforward nature of the case. But even as she dispensed medical advice and reassurances, part of her mind remained focused on Joshua Morrison, wondering how he was recovering and whether his brothers were managing his care properly. The thought surprised her with its intensity. She found herself genuinely concerned about the welfare of men she had known for less than 12 hours. The morning brought a steady stream of patients with routine complaints. A miner with a persistent cough, a rancher's wife seeking medication for her arthritis, an elderly man requiring sutures for a minor cut. Emma treated each case with her usual competence, but she noticed something different in the way people looked at her. Word of her night ride to treat the Garrett shooting had spread through Millbrook's gossip network, as news always did in small, frontier towns. But the stories had taken on embellishments that made Emma uncomfortable. Some people seemed to view her midnight journey as heroically dangerous, while others whispered questions about why she had been away from town during the exact hours when outlaws were known to be in the area. Around midday, Reverend Michael Carson arrived at the clinic. The Methodist minister was a thoughtful man in his 50s who had earned Emma's respect through his practical approach to frontier spirituality. He often visited sick parishioners on her recommendation, and she valued his counsel on the moral complexities that sometimes arose in her medical practice. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I heard about your emergency call last night. Difficult situations seem to find you more often than most." Emma studied his face, trying to gauge whether this was a casual, social visit or something more pointed. "Someone needed medical attention, Reverend. That's what I do." "Indeed it is, and you do it with a dedication that puts many of us to shame." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Emma, you know that I hold your medical work in the highest regard. You've saved lives, eased suffering, brought healing to this community in ways that go far beyond medicine." "I sense a but coming, Reverend." Carson smiled ruefully. "You know me too well, but yes, there is a concern. There are rumors circulating about your activities last night. Nothing specific, mind you, but enough to make certain people suspicious." Emma felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of rumors?" "That you were seen riding north when the Morrison gang was known to be in that area. That your absence coincided suspiciously with the outlaw activity. That perhaps you have connections to these criminals that go beyond what a respectable doctor should maintain." The accusations hung in the air between them like smoke. Emma realized that her worst fears about the consequences of helping Joshua Morrison were already beginning to materialize. "And what do you think, Reverend?" Carson was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I think you're a woman of conscience who follows her medical calling regardless of personal cost. I also think that in this territory, being right and being safe are often very different things." Before Emma could respond, the clinic door burst, open with urgent force. Nathan Morrison stood in the doorway, his young face flushed with panic and exhaustion. Emma's heart leaped with alarm. His presence could only mean that something had gone terribly wrong with Joshua's recovery. "Dr. Whitmore," Nathan gasped, apparently unaware of Reverend Carson's presence. "Please, you have to come. Joshua's taken a turn for the worse. He's burning up with fever again, and Caleb thinks the wound might be infected." The silence that followed Nathan's words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Emma felt the weight of Reverend Carson's stare, knowing that Nathan's desperate plea had just confirmed every suspicion about her connection to the Morrison brothers. Carson stood slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Dr. Whitmore, I believe this young man has mistaken you for someone else. Perhaps he should seek medical attention elsewhere." But Nathan, driven by desperation and exhaustion, pressed forward. "Ma'am, I know this puts you in a bad spot, but Joshua's dying. The fever came back worse than before, and he's talking out of his head. Caleb sent me to fetch you because you're the only one who can save him." Emma faced the moment she had known would come, when her secret alliance with the Morrison brothers would be exposed, forcing her to choose between her comfortable position in respectable society and her commitment to healing, regardless of circumstances. "Nathan," she said carefully, "you need to understand that asking me to treat your brother again puts both of us in serious danger. People are already suspicious about my activities last night." "I don't care about danger," Nathan replied fiercely. "Joshua's got a wife and a baby coming. He can't die because we're worried about what people think." Reverend Carson stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of moral judgment. "Young man, If you're who I think you are, you need to leave this clinic immediately. Dr. Whitmore is a respected member of this community, and she cannot be associated with criminal activity." Nathan turned to face the minister, his youth and desperation making him reckless. "Criminal activity? We're not criminals by choice, Reverend. We're men who got pushed too far and fought back. And this lady, she saved my brother's life because she believes in healing people, not judging them." Emma realized that the confrontation escalating in her clinic would soon attract attention from the street. In a town the size of Millbrook, raised voices and strangers were noticed immediately. "Both of you, please lower your voices," she said firmly. "Nathan, you're putting everyone at risk by being here. And Reverend Carson, I need you to understand that my medical obligations sometimes conflict with social expectations." Carson's expression reflected deep disappointment. "Emma, surely you realize that harboring fugitives makes you complicit in their crimes. Your duty to the community supersedes any obligation to treat criminals." "My duty," Emma replied, feeling anger rise despite her efforts to remain calm, "is to heal the sick and injured, regardless of their social status or legal standing. That's the oath I took when I became a doctor." "You're not a licensed physician," Carson pointed out. "You're a frontier healer whose authority comes from community acceptance. If that community loses faith in your judgment, then the community will have to find another doctor," Emma interrupted. "But I won't abandon a dying man because treating him is politically inconvenient." Nathan had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for causing you trouble, but Joshua's running out of time. Are you coming or not?" Emma looked at the young man's desperate face, then at Reverend Carson's expression of moral disapproval. In that moment, she understood that her comfortable life as Millbrook's respected doctor was ending, regardless of what choice she made. If she refused to help Joshua Morrison, he would likely die, and she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. If she went with Nathan, word would spread that she was actively collaborating with wanted outlaws, destroying her reputation and possibly ending her practice. But the choice, when viewed through the lens of her deepest convictions, was actually simple. "Nathan, give me 5 minutes to gather supplies, and next time approach the clinic from the back alley. The entire town doesn't need to witness these conversations." Reverend Carson shook his head sadly. "Emma, you're making a terrible mistake. This will destroy everything you've built here." Emma met his gaze directly. "Reverend, I've spent my adult life building a reputation as a healer. I won't destroy that reputation by refusing to heal when healing is needed most." As she packed her medical bag with fresh supplies, Emma felt the weight of transformation beginning to settle around her. The simple, predictable life she had known was coming to an end, replaced by something more complex and dangerous, but also more true to her deepest beliefs about the purpose of medicine. Carson lingered as she prepared to leave, making one final appeal. "Emma, please reconsider. These men are outlaws. They've chosen to live outside the law, and that choice has consequences. You don't have to share those consequences." "Reverend," Emma replied, shouldering her medical bag, "these men may have chosen to live outside the law, but they didn't choose to live outside of humanity. As long as they're human beings capable of suffering, they deserve medical care." She turned to Nathan, who'd been waiting with barely controlled impatience. "Lead the way, but we travel carefully. If we're seen together, it could mean trouble for everyone." As they left the clinic through the back entrance, Emma caught sight of several townspeople watching from various vantage points. Word of Nathan's visit had already begun to spread, and she could see the speculation and suspicion in their expressions. Mrs. Henderson stood in front of the general store, whispering urgently to 2 other women. The blacksmith had paused in his work to observe the unusual activity around the clinic. Even children had stopped their play to stare at the mysterious young man who had arrived in such obvious distress. Emma realized that her last moments as an unquestioned member of Millbrook's respectable society were slipping away with each step. By the time she returned from treating Joshua Morrison, the entire town would know about her association with the infamous Outlaw brothers. But as they rode out of town toward the distant line shack where a wounded man fought for his life, Emma felt an unexpected sense of liberation. For 3 years, she had carefully maintained her position as the town's proper lady doctor, always conscious of social expectations and community approval. Now, faced with a choice between respectability and conscience, she had chosen conscience. The consequences would be severe, but they would be honest consequences, flowing from decisions that reflected her deepest values rather than social convenience. The afternoon sun climbed higher as they traveled the increasingly familiar path toward Fletcher's Creek. And with each mile, Emma moved further away from her old life and closer to something new and uncertain, but fundamentally more authentic. Behind them, Millbrook buzzed with rumors and speculation about their respected doctor and her mysterious connection to the territory's most wanted outlaws. Ahead lay a wounded man whose life depended on her skill, and a family of brothers whose gratitude was transforming her understanding of where true loyalty should lie. The sacrifice of her old life was beginning, and there would be no turning back. The fever that had seized Joshua Morrison was more virulent than anything Emma had encountered in her 3 years of frontier practice. By the time she and Nathan reached the line shack, Joshua was delirious, his body burning with a heat that seemed to radiate from within. Caleb met them at the door, his weathered face etched with panic barely held in check. "It started about 2 hours after you left," he explained, helping Emma inside. "First he got restless, then the fever spiked. Now he's talking to people who ain't there, calling for Rebecca like she's in the room." Emma immediately began her examination, noting with alarm that Joshua's surgical wound showed signs of renewed infection, despite her careful work the night before. The flesh around the sutures was inflamed and hot to the touch, and a thin line of red was beginning to track up toward his shoulder, the telltale sign of blood poisoning. "This isn't a setback from the original infection," she announced grimly. "Something new has gotten into the wound. Have you changed the bandages since I left?" Nathan nodded quickly. "Just like you showed us, with clean cloth and that antiseptic solution." Emma examined the bandaging materials they had used and immediately identified the problem. The cloth, while appearing clean, had not been properly sterilized. In the primitive conditions of the line shack, maintaining the sterile environment necessary for post-surgical care was nearly impossible. "We need to get him to a proper medical facility," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how impossible that would be. No hospital or clinic would treat a known outlaw, and moving Joshua in his current condition could kill him. "What are our options?" Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Emma considered the medical realities. Joshua was dying of sepsis, a condition that killed most patients even under ideal circumstances. In a remote line shack with limited supplies, his chances were virtually non-existent. But she had not ridden back through hostile territory and sacrificed her reputation to watch him die from inadequate care. "We're going to have to create a hospital here," she announced. "It's not ideal, but it's his only chance." What followed was the most intensive medical effort of Emma's career. Over the next 4 days, she essentially moved into the line shack, leaving only briefly to retrieve additional supplies from her clinic during the pre-dawn hours when Millbrook slept. Caleb and Nathan became her assistants, learning to follow her instructions with military precision. The first challenge was re-sterilizing Joshua's surgical site. Emma had to remove her original sutures, clean out the new infection, and close the wound again, under even more primitive conditions than before. The procedure required all three of them working in perfect coordination, Caleb holding Joshua steady, Nathan maintaining the oil lamps for light, and Emma performing surgery that would have challenged the best physicians in Denver. During the long hours of caring for their dying brother, Emma began to see the Morrison family with unprecedented clarity. Caleb, despite his reputation as a dangerous outlaw leader, revealed himself to be a man of profound gentleness and intelligence. He read aloud to his delirious brother from a worn volume of Shakespeare that he carried in his saddlebags, his voice carrying the polish of formal education. "You went to college," Emma observed during one of Joshua's quiet periods. "University of Missouri," Caleb confirmed. "Studied literature and philosophy before I came west to help my father establish the farm. Seems like another lifetime now." Nathan, meanwhile, demonstrated a natural aptitude for medical work that surprised Emma. His hands were steady during procedures, his observations about Joshua's condition were consistently accurate, and he showed an intuitive understanding of patient care that couldn't be taught. "You have a gift for this," she told him, after he successfully administered a complex medication regimen without supervision. "I've always been interested in how things work," Nathan replied. "Bodies aren't much different from machines, I suppose. Both need the right parts working together." As Joshua fought for his life, Emma learned the full story of the Morrison brothers and their transformation from respected farmers to notorious outlaws. Their father, Marcus Morrison, had been a veteran of the Mexican War who received land grants in recognition of his military service. The Morrison farm had been a model of frontier success, productive, profitable, and employing several local families. The trouble began when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad decided to route their line through the Morrison Valley. The railroad's corporate partners included several powerful cattle syndicates who wanted to consolidate land ownership in the region. When Marcus Morrison refused to sell at the railroad's artificially depressed price, a systematic campaign of harassment began. "They started by cutting our fences and driving off cattle," Caleb explained during one of their long vigils. "When that didn't work, they poisoned our water source. When Pa still wouldn't sell, they burned our main barn and most of that year's harvest. The legal system provided no relief. The territorial judge who heard their case was a business partner of the railroad's principal investors. When Marcus Morrison attempted to file criminal charges against the men who had burned his property, he was told there was insufficient evidence to proceed. The final blow came when they killed our father," Nathan said, his young face hardening. "With old grief. Made it look like an accident, a fall from his horse while checking fences. But we found boot prints around the body, signs of a struggle. The sheriff called it death by misadventure and closed the case." Emma listened to this account with growing horror and understanding. The Morrison brothers hadn't chosen outlawry from greed or natural violence. They had been systematically destroyed by powerful interests who used legal mechanisms to accomplish what amounted to robbery and murder. "So you decided to fight back," she said. "We decided to survive," Caleb corrected. "Fighting back came later, when we realized we weren't the only ones being crushed by these syndicates. There are dozens of families who've lost their land to the same tactics. Some moved away, some gave up, but a few started fighting." During Joshua's fever dreams, Emma glimpsed another side of the outlaw leader. He spoke constantly of Rebecca, describing their courtship, their wedding, their dreams for the future. Between periods of delirium, he showed Emma a small daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "She's beautiful," Emma said, studying the photograph. "She's everything good in the world," Joshua replied weakly. "I want to build her a house with a garden where she can grow flowers. I want our children to have the kind of childhood we never got. Safe, peaceful, full of books and learning." The domesticity of these dreams contrasted sharply with Joshua's reputation as a dangerous criminal. Emma began to understand that the Morrison brothers' outlawry was a temporary survival strategy rather than a permanent identity. They remained fundamentally decent men who had been forced into impossible circumstances. On the third day of her vigil, Emma received an unexpected visitor. She was changing Joshua's bandages when Caleb appeared at the shack's entrance with a young woman Emma didn't recognize. The visitor was perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair and practical clothing that marked her as someone accustomed to. "In frontier life, Dr. Whitmore," Caleb said, "I'd like you to meet Amanda Foster. She's a friend who's been helping us with supplies and information." Amanda Foster stepped forward with the confidence of someone comfortable in difficult situations. "Dr. Whitmore, I've heard about the work you're doing here. I wanted to thank you personally for saving Joshua's life." Emma studied the young woman with interest. Amanda moved with the easy assurance of someone who belonged in this environment, and the Morrison brothers clearly trusted her completely. "I'm a friend of the family," Amanda explained, apparently reading Emma's curiosity. "My father was one of the other farmers who lost his land to the railroad syndicate. When they burned us out, the Morrison brothers helped us relocate to Denver. I've been working with them ever since." As Amanda helped with Joshua's care, Emma learned that the Morrison gang was far more complex than law enforcement or newspaper accounts suggested. Rather than a simple criminal organization, they operated as the center of an informal network of displaced families and community members who had been victimized by the territorial power structure. "There are about 30 families who depend on us for protection and support," Amanda explained. "Former farmers, miners who've been cheated out of their claims, shopkeepers who've been driven out of business by corporate monopolies. We're not just outlaws, we're what's left of a community that was destroyed by legal thieves." Emma began to understand that she had stumbled into something much larger than 3 brothers forced into outlawry by personal circumstances. The Morrison organization represented a form of resistance to the systematic corruption that was transforming the American West from a land of opportunity into a corporate playground where ordinary people were expendable. "What's your role in all this?" Emma asked Amanda. "I coordinate our supply network and gather information about railroad and syndicate activities. I also help families relocate when they're targeted for harassment. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary." Joshua's condition began to improve markedly on the 4th day. His fever broke completely, his wound showed healthy healing, and he was able to sit up and take solid food. More importantly, his mental clarity had returned, and he was able to participate in the complex discussions about strategy and future plans that seemed to occupy much of the Morrison brothers' time. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, as Emma checked his vital signs, "I want you to know that what you've done for me, for us, goes far beyond medical care. You've shown us that there are still decent people in the world who judge others by their actions rather than their reputations." Emma found herself deeply moved by the gratitude and respect these people showed her. In Millbrook, her medical skills were taken for granted, viewed as a service she provided in exchange for social acceptance and financial support. Here, her healing work was seen as something precious and sacred, worthy of genuine appreciation. "I've learned as much from you as you have from me," she replied honestly. "You've shown me that justice and law aren't always the same thing, that good people can be forced into impossible choices." As Joshua's strength returned, the conversations in the line shack turned increasingly toward future planning. Emma learned that the Morrison brothers were not content to remain outlaws indefinitely. They were actively working toward a larger goal, exposing the corruption that had destroyed their lives and seeking legal remedies through channels that bypassed the compromised territorial courts. "We're collecting evidence," Caleb explained, showing Emma a collection of documents and photographs. Proof of the railroad's illegal tactics, records of bribed officials, testimony from families who've been victimized. We're building a case that we can take to federal authorities in Washington. Nathan had been developing plans for a series of strategic actions designed to attract national attention to the situation in Colorado Territory. If we can get the Eastern newspapers interested, if we can make this a national story, then the territorial power structure won't be able to suppress the truth anymore. Emma studied the maps and documents spread across the shack's rough table, marveling at the sophistication of the Morrison brothers' approach. These were not desperate men striking out blindly at their enemies. They were intelligent strategists, working towards specific political and legal objectives. "How long do you think this will take?" she asked. "Maybe 6 months, maybe a year," Amanda replied. "But we're making progress. 2 families have successfully reclaimed their land through federal intervention after we provided evidence of fraud. And there's a congressional investigator who's expressed interest in our documentation." As Emma prepared to return to Millbrook, after Joshua's recovery, she realized that the past 4 days had fundamentally altered her understanding of justice, community, and her own role as a healer. She had entered the Morrison brothers' world expecting to find dangerous criminals. Instead, she had discovered a sophisticated resistance movement led by intelligent, principled people who were fighting systematic corruption through carefully planned legal and political action. "Dr. Whitmore," Caleb said as she gathered her medical supplies, "I want you to know that you're always welcome here. You've proven yourself to be someone who can be trusted with life and death decisions. That makes you family as far as we're concerned." The word family carried special weight, coming from men who had lost their biological family to violence and corruption. Emma understood that she was being offered membership in something larger than the Morrison brothers, a community of people united by shared principles rather than shared blood. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" she asked. "It means you have a place where you belong, regardless of what happens in Millbrook," Nathan replied. "It means people who will stand by you when others turn away. It means work that serves something larger than yourself." As Emma rode back toward town, she carried with her more than medical supplies and the satisfaction of a successful treatment. She carried a new understanding of her place in the moral landscape of the frontier and an invitation to join a community that valued her skills and principles above her social standing. The comfortable isolation of her previous life was ending, replaced by connections that were deeper and more meaningful than anything she had experienced in respectable society. The Morrison brothers had claimed her as family, and that claim would soon be tested in ways that none of them could anticipate. Behind her, in the line shack by Fletcher's Creek, Joshua Morrison sat up for the first time in days, reading a letter that Amanda had brought from his wife in Denver. His recovery was complete, but more importantly, the community that had embraced Emma was preparing for the next phase of their long campaign for justice. The immersion was complete. Emma Catherine Whitmore had seen the truth behind the Morrison reputation and discovered that sometimes the most dangerous outlaws were the most principled people in an unprincipled world. What remained was to discover whether that truth could survive the tests that lay ahead. But as the 5th day dawned with Joshua finally strong enough to sit up and take proper meals, Emma realized that her extended absence from Millbrook was creating complications she hadn't fully anticipated. Amanda brought disturbing news from her network of contacts in town. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, settling beside Emma near the fire, "I need to tell you what's happening in your absence. Sheriff Coleman has been asking questions about your whereabouts. He's told several people that he's concerned about your safety, given the outlaw activity in the area." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of questions?" He's been to your clinic multiple times, claiming to check on your welfare. Mrs. Henderson told him you'd been called away on medical business, but he's not satisfied with that explanation. Yesterday, he questioned the Garrett family extensively about your activities. The implications were clear. Emma's prolonged absence, combined with the suspicious timing of her initial departure, had focused unwanted attention on her activities. Coleman was methodical and persistent when he suspected something was amiss. "There's more," Amanda continued. "Reverend Carson has been holding private meetings with prominent townspeople. He's not directly accusing you of anything, but he's raising questions about the moral implications of harboring criminals, even for medical purposes." Nathan looked up from where he was helping Joshua with his breakfast. "Doc, maybe you should go back. We can't have you losing everything because of us." But Caleb shook his head firmly. "Nathan's thinking too small. The problem isn't that Emma's been here too long. The problem is that her old life in Millbrook was built on a foundation that was always going to crumble eventually." Emma studied the older Morrison brother's face, recognizing the analytical intelligence that had made him an effective leader. "What do you mean?" "I mean that respectable society in this territory is rotten to the core. The same people who are questioning your moral judgment are the ones who've turned a blind eye to systematic theft and murder, as long as it served their economic interests. They're not upset because you're consorting with criminals. They're upset because you're consorting with the wrong criminals." Joshua, speaking for the first time in days with his full strength, added his perspective. "Dr. Whitmore, in the past 4 days, you've done more genuine healing than most doctors accomplish in years. You've treated a patient who couldn't pay, who couldn't offer you social advancement, who could only give you his gratitude and respect. That's what real medicine looks like." Amanda nodded emphatically. "Emma, I've been watching Millbrook for months as part of our intelligence gathering. Do you know who owns the largest mining interest in the area? The same syndicate that destroyed the Morrison farm. Do you know who holds the mortgage on most of the commercial properties on Main Street? Railroad investors who've been systematically driving out independent businesses." Emma felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "You're saying that Millbrook itself is part of the corruption. I'm saying that Millbrook exists at the pleasure of the same people who made us outlaws," Caleb replied. "The town council, the sheriff, even some of the prominent business people. They're all dependent on the good graces of corporate interests that profit from keeping small communities weak and dependent." This revelation reframed everything Emma thought she knew about her place in Millbrook society. Her medical practice, her reputation, her social standing, all of it existed within a system that was fundamentally compromised. "But there are good people in town," she protested. "The Garretts, Mrs. Henderson, even some of the miners and ranchers. They're not part of any conspiracy." "No," Amanda agreed, "but they're powerless within the current system. They depend on the corrupt power structure for their livelihoods, so they can't challenge it, even when they recognize its injustices." As Emma absorbed this information, she began to understand that her crisis of reputation in Millbrook was not really about her association with the Morrison brothers. It was about the fundamental incompatibility between genuine healing and a social order that profited from maintaining artificial divisions between the deserving and undeserving. "What are my realistic options?" she asked. Nathan spread out a hand-drawn map of the territory on the rough table. "You could return to Millbrook and try to restore your reputation by distancing yourself from us. Deny that you provided medical care. Claim you were coerced. Let Sheriff Coleman use you as a witness against us." "That's not happening," Emma said firmly. "Or," Caleb continued, "you could acknowledge that your old life was built on compromises, that you're no longer willing to make. You could join our effort to create something better." Emma studied the map, which showed not just geographical features but political information. which ranches were corporately owned, which towns were controlled by railroad interests, which areas remained independent. It was a strategic document that revealed the Morrison brothers' deep understanding of the territorial power structure. What would joining your effort actually involve? Amanda leaned forward eagerly. We need a medical coordinator for our network. There are dozens of families who've been displaced, injured, or made ill by the conditions they're forced to live in. They need someone with your skills and training. More than that, Joshua added, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to the subject, we need someone who can serve as a bridge between our resistance network and the respectable elements of territorial society. You have credibility that we lack. Had credibility, Emma corrected. By now, half of Millbrook probably considers me a criminal sympathizer. The half that matters doesn't, Caleb said quietly. The people who need genuine healing, who've been hurt by the same system that destroyed our family, those people will trust you more because you've proven willing to risk everything for your principles. Emma walked to the shack's single window, looking out at the landscape that had become so familiar over the past 5 days. The view encompassed mountains, valleys, and streams that belonged to no single owner, that existed according to natural rather than legal boundaries. It occurred to her that the Morrison brothers' vision of justice was similarly natural, based on human need rather than artificial social constructions. If I make this choice, she said slowly, there's no going back. I'll be finished in Millbrook, probably blacklisted from any respectable community in the territory, but you'll be part of building something new, Nathan replied, something based on actual justice rather than the pretense of civilization. Amanda stood and moved beside Emma. At the window, I made a similar choice 2 years ago. I was engaged to the son of a prominent Denver businessman. I had everything that respectable society could offer: social standing, financial security, a future mapped out according to conventional expectations. Emma turned to study the young woman's face. What changed your mind? I watched my father lose everything he'd worked for to legal thieves who used the courts as weapons. I saw families destroyed while the territorial government looked the other way. I realized that my comfortable future was built on the suffering of people like my own parents. And you don't regret the choice? Amanda smiled. And for the first time since Emma had met her, the expression was completely carefree. I've never regretted choosing truth over comfort. The work we're doing here matters. Every family we help, every piece of evidence we gather, every small victory we achieve. It's all building towards something larger than any of us could accomplish alone. Joshua struggled to his feet, still weak but determined to participate, fully in the conversation. Dr. Whitmore, Emma, you've already made the choice, whether you realize it or not. The moment you rode out in that storm to save my life, you chose principle over safety. Everything since then has just been working. Oh, the implications. Emma considered his words, recognizing their truth. She had indeed crossed a fundamental line when she chose to treat Joshua Morrison despite the risks. Every decision since then had been a continuation of that initial choice. What would be my first assignment? She asked, surprising herself with the question. Caleb smiled broadly, the expression transforming his weathered features. There's a mining camp about 40 miles north of here. Company-owned, controlled by the same syndicate that's been causing trouble throughout the territory. The miners are getting sick from unsafe working conditions, but the company won't allow outside medical care. They need someone who can get inside, assess the situation, and provide treatment without arousing corporate suspicion, Amanda added. Someone with legitimate medical credentials who can document the health violations for our legal case. Nathan spread out another map, this one showing the location of various mining operations. It's dangerous work. If you're caught providing unauthorized medical care or gathering evidence, the company's security forces won't hesitate to use violence. Emma studied the map, noting the remote location of the mining camp and the corporate infrastructure that surrounded it. The challenge appealed to both her medical instincts and her growing desire to confront the systematic injustices she had been ignoring. "When would we leave?" she asked. "We?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "If I join this effort, I want to understand all aspects of it. That means seeing firsthand how the corporate interests operate, learning how your resistance network functions in practice." Amanda grinned with obvious approval. "I like her approach, thorough and practical." Joshua sank back onto his bedroll, exhausted by the conversation, but clearly satisfied with its direction. "Rebecca's going to love you," he said to Emma. "She's always said that the best people are the ones who choose to do right, even when it costs them everything." As the group began planning Emma's integration into their resistance network, she felt a profound sense of rightness about the direction her life was taking. The comfortable predictability of her practice in Millbrook had always felt somehow incomplete, as if she were using only a fraction of her capabilities. Here, surrounded by people who had risked everything for their principles, she found herself challenged in ways that went far beyond medical technique. She was being asked to use her skills, her intelligence, and her courage in service of something larger than personal success or social approval. "There's one more thing," Caleb said as the planning session concluded. "Once you're part of our network, your family, that means we protect each other, we stand by each other, and we never abandon each other to face danger alone." Emma looked around the circle of faces, Nathan's youthful determination, Joshua's quiet strength despite his recent brush with death, Amanda's fierce intelligence, and Caleb's steady leadership. These people had offered her something that Millbrook society never could: unconditional acceptance based on shared values rather than social conformity. "I understand," she said simply. "And I accept." The transformation was complete. Emma Catherine Whitmore was no longer the isolated frontier doctor trying to maintain respectability in a corrupt society. She was a member of a resistance community working to create genuine justice in a territory dominated by corporate greed and political corruption. Outside the line shack, the sun climbed toward its zenith, marking not just another day, but the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing struggle between power and principle that defined life on the American frontier. Emma's first mission, as part of the Morrison Resistance Network, came sooner than anyone had anticipated. 3 days after her formal commitment to their cause, urgent word arrived through Amanda's intelligence network that a crisis was developing at the BlackRock Mining Company's remote operation in the northern mountains. The messenger was a boy, no more than 14, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. He had ridden nearly 50 miles without stopping, bringing news that would test everything Emma had learned about courage and commitment. "There's been a cave-in at BlackRock," the boy gasped, accepting a cup of water from Nathan. 12 men trapped, maybe more. "The company bosses are saying it's too dangerous to mount a rescue, but the miners' families think some of the men might still be alive." Caleb immediately began studying maps of the BlackRock operation, his expression grim. "The company will bring in their own medical team from Denver, but that's a 2-day ride at minimum. If there are survivors in that mine, they'll be dead long before corporate help arrives." "What about the local authorities?" Emma asked. "Surely there's some kind of emergency response protocol." Amanda shook her head bitterly. "BlackRock owns the local sheriff, the territorial judge, and most of the county commissioners. They'll do whatever the company tells them to do, which is nothing that might interfere with mining operations or create liability issues." The domesticity of these dreams contrasted sharply with Joshua's reputation as a dangerous criminal. Emma began to understand that the Morrison brothers' outlawry was a temporary survival strategy rather than a permanent identity. They remained fundamentally decent men who had been forced into impossible circumstances. On the third day of her vigil, Emma received an unexpected visitor. She was changing Joshua's bandages when Caleb appeared at the shack's entrance with a young woman Emma didn't recognize. The visitor was perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair and practical clothing that marked her as someone accustomed to frontier life. "Dr. Whitmore," Caleb said, "I'd like you to meet Amanda Foster. She's a friend who's been helping us with supplies and information." Amanda Foster stepped forward with the confidence of someone comfortable in difficult situations. "Dr. Whitmore, I've heard about the work you're doing here. I wanted to thank you personally for saving Joshua's life." Emma studied the young woman with interest. Amanda moved with the easy assurance of someone who belonged in this environment, and the Morrison brothers clearly trusted her completely. "I'm a friend of the family," Amanda explained, apparently reading Emma's curiosity. "My father was one of the other farmers who lost his land to the railroad syndicate. When they burned us out, the Morrison brothers helped us relocate to Denver. I've been working with them ever since." As Amanda helped with Joshua's care, Emma learned that the Morrison gang was far more complex than law enforcement or newspaper accounts suggested. Rather than a simple criminal organization, they operated as the center of an informal network of displaced families and community members who had been victimized by the territorial power structure. "There are about 30 families who depend on us for protection and support," Amanda explained. "Former farmers, miners who've been cheated out of their claims, shopkeepers who've been driven out of business by corporate monopolies. We're not just outlaws, we're what's left of a community that was destroyed by legal thieves." Emma began to understand that she had stumbled into something much larger than 3 brothers forced into outlawry by personal circumstances. The Morrison organization represented a form of resistance to the systematic corruption that was transforming the American West from a land of opportunity into a corporate playground where ordinary people were expendable. "What's your role in all this?" Emma asked Amanda. "I coordinate our supply network and gather information about railroad and syndicate activities. I also help families relocate when they're targeted for harassment. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary." Joshua's condition began to improve markedly on the 4th day. His fever broke completely, his wound showed healthy healing, and he was able to sit up and take solid food. More importantly, his mental clarity had returned, and he was able to participate in the complex discussions about strategy and future plans that seemed to occupy much of the Morrison brothers' time. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, as Emma checked his vital signs, "I want you to know that what you've done for me, for us, goes far beyond medical care. You've shown us that there are still decent people in the world who judge others by their actions rather than their reputations." Emma found herself deeply moved by the gratitude and respect these people showed her. In Millbrook, her medical skills were taken for granted, viewed as a service she provided in exchange for social acceptance and financial support. Here, her healing work was seen as something precious and sacred, worthy of genuine appreciation. "I've learned as much from you as you have from me," she replied honestly. "You've shown me that justice and law aren't always the same thing, that good people can be forced into impossible choices." As Joshua's strength returned, the conversations in the lion shack turned increasingly toward future planning. Emma learned that the Morrison brothers were not content to remain outlaws indefinitely. They were actively working toward a larger goal, exposing the corruption that had destroyed their lives and seeking legal remedies through channels that bypass the compromised territorial courts. "We're collecting evidence," Caleb explained, showing Emma a collection of documents and photographs, proof of the railroad's illegal tactics, records of bribed officials, testimony from families who've been victimized. "We're building a case that we can take to federal authorities in Washington." Nathan had been developing plans for a series of strategic actions designed to attract national attention to the situation in Colorado Territory. If we can get the Eastern newspapers interested, if we can make this a national story, then the territorial power structure won't be able to suppress the truth anymore. Emma studied the maps and documents spread across the shack's rough table, marveling at the sophistication of the Morrison brothers' approach. These were not desperate men striking out blindly at their enemies. They were intelligent strategists working towards specific political and legal objectives. "How long do you think this will take?" she asked. "Maybe 6 months, maybe a year," Amanda replied. "But we're making progress. 2 families have successfully reclaimed their land through federal intervention after we provided evidence of fraud. And there's a congressional investigator who's expressed interest in our documentation." As Emma prepared to return to Millbrook, after Joshua's recovery, she realized that the past 4 days had fundamentally altered her understanding of justice, community, and her own role as a healer. She had entered the Morrison brothers' world expecting to find dangerous criminals. Instead, she had discovered a sophisticated resistance movement led by intelligent, principled people who were fighting systematic corruption through carefully planned legal and political action. "Dr. Whitmore," Caleb said as she gathered her. "Medical supplies, I want you to know that you're always welcome here. You've proven yourself to be someone who can be trusted with life and death decisions. That makes you family, as far as we're concerned." The word family carried special weight coming from men who had lost their biological family to violence and corruption. Emma understood that she was being offered membership in something larger than the Morrison brothers, a community of people united by shared principles rather than shared blood. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" she asked. "It means you have a place where you belong regardless of what happens in Millbrook," Nathan replied. "It means people who will stand by you when others turn away. It means work that serves, something larger than yourself." As Emma rode back toward town, she carried with her more than medical supplies and the satisfaction of a successful treatment. She carried a new understanding of her place in the moral landscape of the frontier and an invitation to join a community that valued her skills and principles above her social standing. The comfortable isolation of her previous life was ending, replaced by connections that were deeper and more meaningful than anything she had experienced in respectable society. The Morrison brothers had claimed her as family, and that claim would soon be tested in ways that none of them could anticipate. Behind her, in the line shack by Fletcher's Creek, Joshua Morrison sat up for the first time in days, reading a letter that Amanda had brought from his wife in Denver. His recovery was complete, but more importantly, the community that had embraced Emma was preparing for the next phase of their long campaign for justice. The immersion was complete. Emma Catherine Whitmore had seen the truth behind the Morrison reputation and discovered that sometimes the most dangerous outlaws were the most principled people in an unprincipled world. What remained was to discover whether that truth could survive the tests that lay ahead. But as the 5th day dawned with Joshua finally strong enough to sit up and take proper meals, Emma realized that her extended absence from Millbrook was creating complications she hadn't fully anticipated. Amanda brought disturbing news from her network of contacts in town. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, settling beside Emma near the fire. "I need to tell you what's happening in your absence. Sheriff Coleman has been asking questions about your whereabouts. He's told several people that he's concerned about your safety, given the outlaw activity in the area." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of questions?" "He's been to your clinic multiple times, claiming to check on your welfare. Mrs. Henderson told him you'd been called away on medical business, but he's not satisfied with that explanation. Yesterday, he questioned the Garrett family extensively about your activities. The implications were clear. Emma's prolonged absence, combined with the suspicious timing of her initial departure, had focused unwanted attention on her activities. Coleman was methodical and persistent when he suspected something was amiss. "There's more," Amanda continued. "Reverend Carson has been holding private meetings with prominent townspeople. He's not directly accusing you of anything, but he's raising questions about the moral implications of harboring criminals, even for medical purposes." Nathan looked up from where he was helping Joshua with his breakfast. "Doc, maybe you should go back. We can't have you losing everything because of us." But Caleb shook his head firmly. "Nathan's thinking too small. The problem isn't that Emma's been here too long. The problem is that her old life in Millbrook was built on a foundation that was always going to crumble eventually." Emma studied the older Morrison brother's face, recognizing the analytical intelligence that had made him an effective leader. "What do you mean?" "I mean that respectable society in this territory is rotten to the core. The same people who are questioning your moral judgment are the ones who've turned a blind eye to systematic theft and murder, as long as it served their economic interests. They're not upset because you're consorting with criminals. They're upset because you're consorting with the wrong criminals." Joshua, speaking for the first time in days, with his full strength, added his perspective. "Dr. Whitmore, in the past 4 days, you've done more genuine healing than most doctors accomplish in years. You've treated a patient who couldn't pay, who couldn't offer you social advancement, who could only give you his gratitude and respect. That's what real medicine looks like." Emma felt anger building in her chest. Anger at a system that valued corporate profits over human lives, that treated working men as expendable resources rather than human beings worthy of rescue efforts. "How long would it take us to reach the mine?" she asked. 6 hours of hard riding," Nathan replied. "But Emma, you need to understand what we'd be walking into. BlackRock employs private security forces that shoot first and ask questions later. They don't allow unauthorized personnel anywhere near their operations. And if we're caught," Caleb added, "it won't just be arrest we're facing. BlackRock's security chief is a man named Pike Anderson, former Army sergeant who was discharged for excessive brutality. He's killed miners for less than what we'd be attempting." Emma absorbed this information while watching the young messenger. Wolf down, bread and meat. The boy was clearly one of the mining family's children, risking his own safety to bring word of the disaster to anyone who might help. "How many families are affected?" she asked him. "My pa's down there," the boy replied, his voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "And my uncle, and most of the other men from our section of the camp. There's maybe 30 women and children with no way to support themselves if the men don't come out." The human cost of corporate indifference was laid bare in the boy's simple words. These weren't just mining statistics. They were fathers, husbands, sons whose families faced destitution if they perished in the collapsed tunnels. "I'm going," Emma announced, standing and moving toward her medical supplies. "With or without support, I'm going to that mine." "Emma, this isn't like treating Joshua," Amanda warned. "This is walking into a corporate fortress where they have every legal right to detain or kill intruders. If something goes wrong, there won't be any rescue coming for us." "Then we make sure nothing goes wrong," Emma replied, checking her surgical instruments and medications. "You said I was part of this family now. Well, families don't abandon each other when lives are at stake." Caleb exchanged looks with his brothers, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded with decision. "All right, but we do this smart. This isn't a rescue mission. It's an infiltration operation. We get in, provide medical assistance to any survivors, and get out without alerting corporate security." What followed was the most intensive planning session Emma had ever participated in. The Morrison brothers approached the mission with military precision, studying maps, assigning roles, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. Amanda, would coordinate with her contacts in nearby towns, creating diversions that might draw security attention away from the mine entrance. Nathan would handle reconnaissance, using his skills in stealth movement to assess the situation before the main team arrived. Caleb would lead the infiltration team, while Emma would focus entirely on medical emergencies. "Remember," Caleb emphasized, as they prepared to depart, "our primary objective is saving lives, not fighting BlackRock security. We avoid confrontation whenever possible, and if we're discovered, we retreat immediately." The ride to BlackRock took them through some of the most challenging terrain Emma had ever navigated. The mining company had deliberately chosen a remote location to minimize outside oversight, building their operation in a narrow mountain valley accessible only through treacherous passes. As they approached the mining complex, Emma could see why BlackRock felt secure in ignoring territorial authority. The operation was essentially a private kingdom, complete with company housing, a company store, and armed guards patrolling clearly marked boundaries. Warning signs in multiple languages threatened severe consequences for unauthorized entry. Nathan returned from his scouting mission with disturbing intelligence. The cave-in happened in the deepest section of the mine, about 800 feet underground. Company supervisors are claiming the rescue would require specialized equipment that isn't available, but I could see mining machinery sitting idle that could clear the collapse in hours. "Why aren't they using it?" Emma asked. "Because," Caleb replied grimly, "a rescue effort would require shutting down active mining operations in adjacent tunnels. BlackRock would rather lose 12 miners than lose a day's production of ore." The callous calculation of corporate priorities struck Emma with fresh outrage. These were human beings trapped underground, slowly suffocating or dying of injuries, while company executives weighed their lives against profit margins. "How do we get inside?" she asked. Amanda pointed to a section of the valley where mine waste had created a series of erosion channels. "There's a drainage tunnel that connects to the lower levels of the mine. It's not guarded because it's supposedly too small for human passage, but Nathan thinks we can make it work." The infiltration began at sunset, when changing guard shifts would provide the best opportunity for undetected movement. Emma found herself crawling through a drainage tunnel barely wide enough for her shoulders, her medical bag strapped tightly to her back and her clothes soaked with icy water. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of rough stone and standing water. But finally, they emerged into one of the mine's lower levels, a network of tunnels carved from solid rock and lit by occasional oil lamps. The sound of human voices led them toward the collapse site, where they found a scene of desperate activity. Miners working with hand tools and improvised equipment were trying to clear a passage through tons of fallen rock, their efforts hampered by the constant threat of additional cave-ins. "Who's in charge here?" Caleb asked, approaching a grimy foreman who was directing the rescue effort. The man turned, his face showing initial suspicion that transformed into hope when he saw Emma's medical bag. "I'm Tom Sullivan, shift supervisor, and you folks are either angels or the bravest fools in Colorado territory." "We're here to help," Emma said simply. "How many men are trapped, and do you have any communication with them?" 12 men in the main working area, maybe 3 more in a side tunnel. We've been able to hear voices from the main group, but nothing from the others. The biggest problem is that they're running out of air. We estimate maybe 4 hours before carbon dioxide levels become lethal. Emma immediately began assessing the medical implications. Carbon dioxide poisoning, potential injuries from falling rock, dehydration and shock were all likely complications. But the time constraint meant that conventional rescue approaches were impossible. "What about emergency air shafts?" she asked. "There's one that should connect to their section, but it's been blocked by smaller cave-ins. We could clear it, but company orders are to prioritize protecting the main tunnel structure over rescue operations. Caleb's jaw tightened with controlled anger. Company orders? Security Chief Anderson made it clear that any rescue effort that threatens corporate infrastructure will be stopped by force. He's got armed guards positioned at all the main tunnel entrances. Emma realized that they were facing not just a medical emergency, but a confrontation with corporate power that valued property over human life. The trapped miners were dying, while company security prevented their own colleagues from mounting an effective rescue. "Where is this Anderson now?" Nathan asked. "In the main administration building, about half a mile from here. He's been holding meetings with company executives from Denver who arrived this afternoon. Amanda's intelligence network had been accurate. BlackRock was more concerned with managing legal liability than saving trapped workers. The arrival of corporate executives suggested that they were already preparing to write off the trapped miners as an acceptable business loss. "Tom," Emma said, "I need you to show me everything you know about the trapped miners' condition. Who's injured? Who has medical conditions that might complicate their situation? Who has families depending on them?" As Sullivan briefed her on the trapped men, Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling around her like a physical burden. These weren't anonymous statistics. They were individuals with names, families, dreams, and fears. James Morrison, a 19-year-old saving money to marry his girlfriend. Patrick O'Brien, a father of 4 whose wife was expecting their 5th child. Robert Chen, a former railroad worker who had come to the mines seeking better wages. "The air shaft," Emma said suddenly. "How long would it take to clear if you had enough men working on it?" "Maybe 2 hours with a full crew, but Anderson's forbidden any large-scale rescue effort." Emma looked at Caleb, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They had come here planning a quiet medical mission, but the situation demanded something more dramatic and dangerous. What if Anderson and his security forces were distracted by a more immediate threat? Caleb asked. Like what? Like a coordinated attack on BlackRock's main operations, something big enough to draw all their attention away from the mine levels. Emma understood immediately what Caleb was proposing. The Morrison brothers would sacrifice their own safety, drawing corporate security into a confrontation that would allow the miners to mount their rescue effort. "That's suicide," she protested. "Anderson has dozens of armed guards and all the advantages of defensive positions." "Not if we're smart about it," Nathan replied, already studying the layout of the mining complex. "The company maintains explosive charges for blasting operations. If we could threaten their main storage depot, you'd be branded as terrorists," Emma said. "Whatever public sympathy you've built would disappear overnight." Caleb smiled grimly. "Emma, we've been branded as criminals since the day we refused to let the railroad steal our father's land. Public opinion stopped mattering to us a long time ago." But Amanda shook her head firmly. "There's a better way. Emma, you said you wanted to understand all aspects of our operation. Well, this is where your medical credentials become a strategic weapon." Emma looked at her with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're going to walk into that administration building and demand access to the trapped miners as a territorial health inspector. You're going to create such a public relations nightmare that BlackRock will have no choice but to allow the rescue effort." The audacity of the plan took Emma's breath away. "They'll never believe I have that kind of authority." "They will, if you act like you do," Amanda replied, producing an official-looking document from her satchel. "One of our network contacts works in the territorial government. This gives you emergency medical authority in disaster situations." Emma studied the document, noting its official seals and legal language. "Is this legitimate?" "Legitimate enough to create doubt in corporate minds," Caleb said, "and doubt is all we need to buy time for the rescue effort." As they finalized their plan, Emma realized that she was about to face the ultimate test of her commitment to the Morrison cause. She would be walking alone into a corporate stronghold, risking not just arrest, but potential violence, trusting her life to forged documents and sheer audacity. "What if they call my bluff?" she asked. "Then we fall back to Plan B," Nathan replied, checking his weapons, "which involves a lot more explosions and considerably less subtlety." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for what might be the most dangerous performance of her life. But as she thought about the 12 men slowly suffocating in the collapsed mine, the choice became clear. "Tom," she said to the shift supervisor, "give me 20 minutes to create a distraction, then get every available man working on that air shaft. And don't stop for anything short of a direct order from the territorial governor." Sullivan nodded grimly. "Ma'am, I don't know who you folks are, but those men down there have wives and children depending on them. You give us the chance, and we'll get them out." Emma shouldered her medical bag and walked toward the tunnel entrance that would take her to the surface and the greatest gamble of her life. Behind her, the Morrison brothers prepared for their own roles in a desperate plan that could save 12 lives or destroy everything they had worked to build. The crisis test had begun, and there would be no middle ground between triumph and disaster. Emma emerged from the mine tunnel into the crisp mountain evening, her medical bag in one hand and the forged territorial authority document in the other. The BlackRock Mining Company's administrative complex loomed before her like a fortress, its windows glowing with lamplight and its perimeter patrolled by armed guards who moved with military precision. She had 20 minutes to create enough chaos to allow the rescue operation to proceed. 20 minutes to transform herself from frontier doctor to territorial authority figure, armed with nothing but confidence and a desperate hope that corporate bureaucrats could be intimidated by official-sounding language and impressive documents. The main gate was guarded by 2 men carrying rifles, their company uniforms marking them as professional security rather than local miners pressed into guard duty. Emma approached them with the kind of purposeful stride she had seen territorial officials use when they visited Millbrook on government business. "I need immediate access to Pike Anderson," she announced, producing her document with theatrical authority. "I'm Dr. Emma Whitmore, Territorial Health Inspector, and I'm here to investigate reports of unsafe working conditions and inadequate emergency response protocols." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. They had clearly been instructed to prevent unauthorized access, but the official nature of Emma's claim created the kind of jurisdictional confusion that corporate security forces dreaded. "Ma'am, we'll need to verify your credentials with—" "Officer," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying the sharp edge of governmental impatience, "there are 12 men trapped in a collapsed mine tunnel, and every minute of delay increases their risk of death. Do you really want to explain to a territorial review board why company security prevented a medical inspector from responding to a mining disaster?" The threat of bureaucratic consequences achieved what mere authority might not have. The first, a guard gestured toward the administrative building, while the second moved to escort her. "Mr. Anderson's in the main conference room with the executives from Denver," the guard explained as they walked. "But ma'am, he's not going to be happy about being interrupted. Officer, I'm not here to make Mr. Anderson happy. I'm here to ensure that this company complies with territorial safety regulations and emergency response requirements." The administrative building's interior reflected BlackRock's corporate wealth and power. Thick carpets, mahogany furniture, and oil paintings created an atmosphere of established authority that was designed to intimidate visitors. But Emma had spent the past week learning that impressive facades often concealed moral corruption, and she felt no intimidation, only growing anger at the contrast between corporate luxury and the desperate conditions in the mine below. Pike. Anderson proved to be exactly what Emma had expected, a large, brutal-looking man whose bearing suggested someone accustomed to solving problems through violence rather than negotiation. He was seated at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by men in expensive suits who looked like they had never worked a day of physical labor in their lives. "What's the meaning of this interruption?" Anderson demanded, rising from his chair as Emma entered the room. "Mr. Anderson, I'm Dr. Emma Whitmore, Territorial Health Inspector," she replied, placing her document on the conference table with official authority. "I'm here to investigate this company's response to the mining accident and to ensure compliance with territorial safety regulations." One of the suited executives, a thin man with nervous eyes, reached for the document. "Inspector Whitmore, I'm Regional Director Harrison. We weren't notified that territorial authorities were responding to this incident." Emma had prepared for this challenge. "Director Harrison, territorial health inspectors respond to mining emergencies under emergency protocols that don't require advance notification. Our mandate is to protect worker safety and ensure proper emergency medical care." Anderson moved closer, his intimidating bulk clearly intended to frighten her into retreat. "Lady, I don't care what kind of paper you're waving around. This is a private corporate operation, and you have no authority here." "Mr. Anderson," Emma replied calmly, "territorial health and safety regulations supersede corporate authority in emergency situations. I have the legal right to inspect all areas of this facility and to interview any personnel involved in emergency response." She pulled out her medical bag and opened it with deliberate ceremony, revealing surgical instruments and official-looking bottles of medication. "Furthermore, I have the authority to provide emergency medical care to any workers who require it, including those currently trapped in your collapsed tunnel." The mention of the trapped miners caused visible discomfort among the executives. They had clearly been hoping to manage the situation quietly, without attracting territorial government attention. "Inspector," Director Harrison said carefully, "the trapped area is structurally unstable. Our engineering assessment indicates that attempted rescue operations could trigger additional collapses that would endanger more workers." Emma had expected this excuse and was prepared with a response that would expose its hollowness. "Director Harrison, I need to see that engineering assessment immediately. Territorial regulations require that all emergency response decisions be based on documented professional analysis." "The assessment is still being prepared," Harrison admitted reluctantly. "So you've condemned 12 men to death based on an engineering assessment that doesn't actually exist?" Emma's voice carried the sharp edge of official outrage. "Mr. Harrison, that's a violation of territorial emergency response protocols that could result in criminal charges." Anderson stepped forward aggressively, his hand moving toward the weapon at his belt. "Look here, lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but—" "Mr. Anderson," Emma interrupted, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "are you threatening a territorial health inspector in the performance of her duties? Because that's a federal offense that carries a mandatory prison sentence." The room fell silent as the corporate executives absorbed the implications of Emma's statement. They were clearly calculating the risks of different courses of action, weighing their desire to avoid rescue operations against the potential consequences of obstructing territorial authority. During this crucial moment of uncertainty, sounds of activity began emanating from outside the building. Shouts, running footsteps, and the distant noise of mining equipment being moved into position. The rescue operation had begun, and every minute that Emma could keep the executives distracted increased the chances of success. "Inspector Whitmore," Harrison said slowly, Perhaps we could arrange for you to observe our emergency response procedures from a safe distance. Director Harrison, I need immediate access to the trapped miners to assess their medical condition. Any delay in providing emergency medical care could constitute negligent homicide under territorial law. Anderson was growing visibly agitated, his professional instincts telling him that something was wrong, but his inexperience with governmental authority making him uncertain how to respond. I'm calling the territorial capital to verify your credentials, he announced, moving toward a telegraph apparatus in the corner of the room. Emma felt her heart skip, knowing that any attempt to verify her authority would expose her deception within minutes. But she had anticipated this possibility and prepared a response that might buy crucial additional time. Mr. Anderson, you're certainly entitled to contact territorial headquarters, but I should warn you that interfering with an emergency medical response while verification is pending could be construed as willful obstruction of public safety. She moved to the window overlooking the mining complex, where she could see increased activity around the main tunnel entrances. Furthermore, I can see that rescue operations are already underway, which suggests that your on-site personnel understand their legal obligations, even if management does not. The executives crowded around the window, watching with growing alarm as miners who had been idle all day suddenly began operating heavy equipment and coordinating large-scale movement of materials. Anderson, Director Harrison snapped, I thought you had the situation under control. I do have it under control, Anderson replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. Those men don't have authorization to begin rescue operations. Emma seized on the corporate confusion to press her advantage. Gentlemen, territorial law requires that emergency medical response take precedence over corporate authorization. Those miners are fulfilling their legal obligation to attempt rescue of trapped colleagues. Anderson grabbed his rifle and started toward the door. I'm putting a stop to this right now. Mr. Anderson, Emma called sharply, if you interfere with an emergency rescue operation that's being conducted under Territorial Health Authority, you'll be subject to immediate arrest and federal prosecution. The security chief paused, clearly torn between his corporate loyalty and his uncertainty about the legal implications of defying territorial authority. During this crucial moment of hesitation, a commotion erupted outside the building. Voices raised in excitement, the sound of running feet and calls for medical assistance. The rescue operation had achieved some kind of breakthrough. Emma moved toward the door with official determination. Gentlemen, it sounds like my medical services are required. I trust that BlackRock Mining Company will cooperate fully with territorial emergency response protocols. But as she reached for the door handle, Anderson finally overcame his confusion and moved to block her path. Nobody leaves this room until we sort out exactly who you are and what authority you actually have. The confrontation had reached its critical moment. Emma was trapped in a room with increasingly suspicious corporate executives, while outside, the success of the rescue operation depended on continued confusion about her authority. At that moment, the door burst open with dramatic force. Nathan Morrison stood in the doorway, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes blazing with the kind of fierce determination that had made his family legendary throughout the territory. Dr. Whitmore, he announced loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, we've broken through to the trapped miners. You're needed immediately for emergency medical care. Anderson spun toward Nathan with his rifle raised, but the young Morrison brother was already moving, with the quick precision of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Who the hell are you? Anderson demanded. I'm Nathan Morrison, Nathan replied with calm pride, and Dr. Whitmore is under the protection of my family. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Every person present recognized the Morrison. Reputation and the implications of Nathan's statement were immediately clear. Emma was not just a territorial health inspector, she was allied with the territory's most notorious outlaws. "Well, well," Anderson said with grim satisfaction. "Looks like our mysterious inspector has some interesting connections." Director Harrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Inspector Whitmore, if that's even your real name, you're under citizen's arrest for fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy with known criminals." Emma looked around the room at the hostile faces surrounding her, then at Nathan, whose presence had both rescued and doomed her deception. In that moment, she realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer trying to maintain a foothold in respectable society while secretly helping outlaws. She was openly allied with the Morrison cause, for better or worse. "Gentlemen," she said with calm dignity, "my name is Dr. Emma Catherine Whitmore, and I'm a physician committed to saving lives regardless of corporate policies or social prejudices. Nathan Morrison and his brothers have shown more honor and decency than any corporate executive I've encountered." Anderson raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Emma. "Lady, you just signed your death warrant. Harboring fugitives is a hanging offense in this territory." But Nathan was already moving, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt, with the smooth efficiency of someone who had faced desperate situations before. "Mr. Anderson," a new voice called from the doorway. "I'd think carefully before threatening a lady in my presence." Caleb Morrison stepped into the room with the quiet authority that had made him a natural leader, followed by Amanda and 3 miners Emma didn't recognize. The corporate executives found themselves facing not just notorious outlaws, but a coalition that included some of their own workers. "Caleb Morrison," Anderson breathed, his rifle now wavering between multiple targets. "Mr. Anderson, I believe you have some of my friends in this room, and I'd like them back." Director Harrison looked frantically. Between the armed outlaws and his security chief, "Anderson, do something." "I'm thinking," Anderson replied tightly, clearly calculating odds that had suddenly become much less favorable. Amanda stepped forward, producing a camera from her bag. "Gentlemen, I'd like to document this historic moment. The day that BlackRock mining company executives chose to threaten a medical professional who was trying to save trapped miners. The flash powder ignited with a brilliant burst of light, temporarily blinding everyone in the room. In the confusion that followed, Emma felt Nathan's hand on her arm, guiding her toward the door. "Time to go, Doc," he said quietly. As they moved toward the exit, Emma could hear Anderson shouting orders to his security forces. But the corporate response was hampered by confusion and the need to avoid harming the miners who had allied themselves with the Morrison rescue effort. Outside the administrative building, Emma found herself in the middle of the most remarkable scene of her life. Dozens of miners were celebrating around the main tunnel entrance, where 12 exhausted but living men were being helped to the surface. The rescue operation had succeeded completely, saving every trapped worker despite corporate opposition. "Dr. Whitmore," one of the rescued miners called out, stumbling toward her with obvious relief. "They told us a territorial inspector was fighting to get us out." "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for not giving up on us." Emma felt tears stinging her eyes as she began examining the rescued men, checking for injuries and signs of carbon dioxide poisoning. These were the lives that had been saved by her deception, the families that would remain intact because she had chosen courage over safety. Tom Sullivan appeared at her side, his face beaming with gratitude and respect. "Doc, I don't know how you folks pulled it off, but you saved 12 good men tonight. Their families will remember this forever." As Emma worked to provide medical care to the rescued miners, she became aware of a larger transformation taking place around her. The successful rescue had galvanized the entire mining community, creating a sense of collective power that had been absent before. Dr. Whitmore, one of the miners' wives said, approaching with obvious emotion. "My husband James is one of the men you saved. We've got 7 children, and without him—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but her gratitude was evident. Amanda appeared beside Emma, her camera documenting the medical care being provided to the rescued workers. "Emma, this is exactly what we needed. Evidence of corporate negligence, proof that miners can organize effective rescue operations when management fails, and demonstration that the Morrison network serves the interests of working families." Caleb surveyed the scene with satisfaction. "More than that, we've created a new alliance. These miners have seen that our family will risk everything to save their lives. That's going to change the power dynamic throughout the territory." Nathan was coordinating with the rescued miners to gather evidence about BlackRock's safety violations and negligent emergency response. "Doc, we're going to need detailed medical reports on the conditions these men endured. Your documentation could be crucial for legal action against the company." Emma realized that her role in the Morrison network was evolving beyond simple medical care. She was becoming a bridge between the outlaw resistance and the larger community of working people who were victimized by corporate power. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Caleb replied, "we take this story to every mining camp, every farming community, every group of people who've been told they have no power against corporate interests. We show them what's possible when ordinary folks stand together." The celebration continued around the successful rescue. Emma felt the weight of her complete transformation settling around her. She was no longer Dr. Emma Whitmore of Millbrook, respectable frontier physician. She was Dr. Emma Whitmore of the Morrison Network, ally of outlaws, enemy of corporate oppression, and advocate for the powerless. The change was irreversible and absolute. There would be no going back to her old life, no restoration of her previous respectability, no comfortable neutrality in the conflicts that defined frontier society. But as she looked around at the grateful faces of the rescued miners and their families, at the Morrison brothers who had welcomed her as family, at the community of resistance that was forming around shared principles rather than shared blood, Emma realized that she had never been happier or more fulfilled. The transformation was complete, and it was exactly what she had been meant to become. 6 months after the BlackRock mine rescue, Emma stood on the porch of a newly constructed medical clinic that served as the headquarters of what newspapers had begun calling the Morrison Medical Network. The building was located in a valley that had once housed Caleb Morrison's family farm, now transformed into a thriving community that attracted displaced families, reformed outlaws, and idealistic professionals from across the territory. The changes that had rippled outward from that stormy night when she first treated Joshua Morrison had exceeded even Caleb's ambitious vision. What had begun as a simple act of medical mercy had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the power structure of the entire Colorado territory. Through the clinic's windows, Emma could see the morning's activities beginning. Amanda Foster, now serving as the network's coordinator of social services, was meeting with a delegation of farmers whose land had been threatened by railroad expansion. Nathan Morrison, his engineering skills finally put to constructive use, was reviewing plans for a new school that would serve children from dozens of families who had found refuge in the growing community. The clinic itself had evolved far beyond Emma's original medical practice in Millbrook. 3 additional physicians had joined the staff, including Dr. Rebecca Morrison, Joshua's wife, who had completed her medical training in Denver and chosen to practice among the people her husband's family had fought to protect. "Mrs. Morrison," Emma called to the young woman who was preparing for morning surgery, "how is our patient from the Silver Creek mine?" Rebecca looked up from her preparation, her face bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. "His lung function has improved dramatically since we removed him from the contaminated environment. He should be able to return to his family next week, though obviously not to mining work. The Silver Creek case had become emblematic of the network's broader mission when corporate-owned mines created health hazards that threatened workers' lives. The Morrison Medical Network provided both treatment and documentation that supported legal challenges to unsafe working conditions. Emma moved through the clinic, checking on patients whose cases illustrated the complex web of social and economic problems that the network had begun to address. A former railroad worker whose injury had been ignored by company physicians was recovering from surgery that would restore full use of his arm. A farmer's daughter who had been denied treatment at a corporate-owned hospital because her family couldn't pay was responding well to medication for a serious heart condition. "Dr. Whitmore," called a voice from the clinic's entrance. Emma turned to see Sheriff William Crawford of Golden, a territorial law enforcement officer whose cooperation had proven crucial to the network's legal legitimacy. "Sheriff Crawford," she replied, noting the serious expression on the lawman's face. "What brings you here so early?" Crawford removed his hat, his manner respectful despite the gravity of his message. "Dr. Whitmore, I've got word from the territorial capital. There's been developments in the BlackRock case that you need to know about." Emma felt a familiar tension in her stomach. Despite the network's growing success and legitimacy, the specter of legal retaliation from corporate interests remained. A constant threat. What kind of developments? "The federal investigation that was triggered by your documentation has resulted in criminal charges against BlackRock's senior management. Pike Anderson has been arrested for assault on territorial officials, and Director Harrison is facing charges related to willful endangerment of workers." Emma felt a surge of satisfaction that was immediately tempered by caution. "And the implications for us?" "Well, that's the interesting part. The federal prosecutor wants to offer you and the Morrison brothers immunity from any charges related to the BlackRock incident in exchange for your cooperation as witnesses." The offer represented a dramatic shift in the government's attitude toward the Morrison network. 6 months ago, they had been branded as dangerous criminals. Now, federal authorities were treating them as legitimate witnesses to corporate crimes. "What does Caleb think about this?" Emma asked. "He wants to discuss it with the entire council before making any decisions. There's a meeting this afternoon if you're available." The council that Crawford referenced had evolved as the network's governing body, including the Morrison brothers, Emma, Amanda, Rebecca, and representatives from the various communities that had allied themselves with the organization. It was an unusual form of governance that combined democratic principles with the practical necessities of operating in a hostile political environment. As Crawford departed, Emma reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in such a short time. The Morrison brothers, once hunted as dangerous outlaws, were now being courted by federal authorities as allies in the fight against corporate corruption. At midday, Emma received an unexpected visitor that illustrated how far the network's reputation had spread. A well-dressed woman in her 40s approached the clinic with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Dr. Whitmore," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Patterson, correspondent for the Denver Post. I've been following the work of your organization, and I'd like to conduct an interview about the Morrison Medical Network's impact on territorial healthcare." Emma studied the journalist with interest. Press coverage had been crucial to the network's growing legitimacy, helping to reshape public perception of the Morrison brothers from dangerous criminals to folk heroes fighting corporate oppression. "What specific aspects of our work are you interested in discussing?" Patterson opened a notebook, her manner professional but obviously sympathetic. "I'm particularly interested in how you've managed to create effective healthcare delivery in areas that traditional medical establishments have ignored or abandoned." As they toured the clinic, Emma explained the network's approach to addressing the intersection of medical and social problems. Unlike conventional medical practice, which focused on treating individual patients in isolation, the Morrison Medical Network addressed the environmental and economic factors that created health problems in the first place. For example, Emma said, leading Patterson to a ward where miners were recovering from lung ailments, "We don't just treat black lung disease, we document the working conditions that cause it and provide evidence for legal challenges to unsafe mining practices." Patterson interviewed several patients, documenting stories that illustrated the human cost of corporate negligence and the life-changing impact of accessible medical care. A young mother whose infant had been saved by emergency surgery spoke emotionally about the difference between the network's compassionate care and the cold indifference she had encountered at corporate-owned facilities. "Dr. Whitmore," Patterson said as the interview concluded, "your organization has created something remarkable here. You've demonstrated that healthcare can be both medically effective and socially transformative." The afternoon council meeting took place in a large room that had been built specifically for community gatherings. In addition to the core leadership, representatives from mining camps, farming communities, and displaced families had traveled significant distances to participate in decisions that would affect the network's future. Caleb opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Friends, we're facing a choice that will determine whether we continue as an underground resistance movement or try to become a legitimate political force within the territorial system." Amanda presented the details of the federal immunity offer, explaining both its potential benefits and risks. Accepting immunity would give us legal protection and official recognition, but it would also require us to operate within governmental constraints that might limit our effectiveness. Nathan had prepared a comprehensive analysis of the network's current position and future options. "We've reached a point where we are too large and too visible to continue operating entirely outside legal channels. But we're also too successful to simply dissolve ourselves into the existing political structure." Emma listened to the discussion with growing appreciation for the complexity of the choices they faced. The network had succeeded beyond anyone's initial expectations, but success brought new challenges that required different strategies. "I'd like to hear from our community representatives," she said. "What do the families we serve think about this decision?" Maria Santos, speaking for the displaced farming families, was direct in her response. "Dr. Whitmore, our families don't care whether you're legal or illegal. We care whether our children get medical care when they're sick, and whether we have protection from the companies that want to steal our land." Tom Sullivan, representing the mining communities, agreed. "The companies fear you folks because you've proven that working people can organize and fight back. If becoming legal helps you do that more effectively, then we support it. But if it means compromising your principles, then we'd rather have you as outlaws on our side than officials working for the system." Joshua Morrison, now fully recovered and serving as the network's liaison with legal reform movements, offered a different perspective. "We have an opportunity to change the system from within, to use our influence to create laws that actually protect working families instead of corporate interests." The debate continued for hours, exploring every aspect of the decision and its implications. As evening approached, Caleb called for a final vote. All those in favor of accepting federal immunity and transitioning to legitimate political action. About half the council members raised their hands, including Joshua and Rebecca Morrison. All those in favor of declining immunity and maintaining our independence. The remaining members voted for continued independence, including Nathan and Amanda. Emma realized that her vote would determine the outcome. As all eyes turned to her, she felt the weight of responsibility for a movement that had grown far beyond her original decision to treat a wounded outlaw. "6 months ago," she said slowly, "I made a choice to heal someone who needed healing, regardless of social expectations or legal consequences. That choice led to everything we've accomplished. Since then," she paused, looking around the room at faces that represented the network's diverse coalition, "I believe we should accept the federal immunity offer, but only on our terms. We use legal recognition to expand our work, but we never compromise our principles or abandon the people who depend on us." The vote carried, but Emma's modified approach required careful negotiation with federal authorities. Over the following weeks, she found herself serving as the primary liaison between the Morrison network and government officials who were still learning to treat former outlaws as legitimate political partners. The negotiations resulted in an unprecedented agreement. The Morrison Medical Network would receive federal recognition as a territorial health service organization with authority to operate clinics and schools throughout Colorado. In exchange, they would provide expertise and evidence to support federal efforts to combat corporate corruption and improve working conditions. A year after the agreement was finalized, Emma stood before a gathering of territorial officials, federal investigators, and community representatives to present the network's annual report. The statistics were remarkable. 12 new clinics established, over 3,000 patients treated, 47 successful legal challenges to corporate malfeasance, and 15 communities that had successfully resisted land acquisition schemes. But numbers don't tell the complete story, Emma concluded her presentation. The real measure of our success is the transformation we've witnessed in communities that had been written off as powerless and expendable. She gestured to the audience, which included former outlaws who now served as community leaders, families who had reclaimed their land through legal action, and children who were receiving education in schools that emphasized both academic learning and social justice. After the formal presentation, Emma found herself surrounded by reporters, government officials, and community members who wanted to understand how such a dramatic transformation had been possible. "Dr. Whitmore," one federal official asked, "what would you say is the most important lesson from the Morrison Network experience?" Emma considered the question, thinking about the long journey from that stormy night when she had first opened her door to Nathan Morrison. "I think the most important lesson is that individual choices matter more than we often realize. When we choose compassion over convenience, principle over safety, truth over comfort, those choices create ripples that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances." As the gathering concluded and people began to disperse, Emma walked outside to find the Morrison brothers waiting for her on the steps of the territorial building. "Well, Doc," Caleb said with a smile, "looks like we've come a long way from that line shack by Fletcher's Creek." "We've all come a long way," Emma replied, looking around at the bustling territorial capital where former outlaws now walked freely. As respected community leaders, Nathan had married Amanda Foster the previous spring, and they were expecting their first child. Joshua and Rebecca's daughter was now 6 months old, a healthy baby who would grow up in a world significantly different from the one her parents had known. "What's next for the network?" Nathan asked. Emma smiled, feeling the familiar sense of purpose that had driven her since that first night of crisis and choice. There are still communities that need medical care, still corporations that abuse their workers, still families that need protection from powerful interests. The work continues. As they walked through the streets of Denver, now a city where the Morrison name commanded respect rather than fear, Emma reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had transformed them all. A storm, a wounded man, a choice made in the darkness. These small beginnings had grown into a movement that was reshaping the moral landscape of the American frontier. The evening sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber, the same colors that had marked that autumn morning when Nathan Morrison had first appeared at her clinic seeking help for his dying brother. But now, those colors illuminated a world where outlaws had become legislators, where former criminals were honored as heroes, and where a frontier doctor's commitment to healing had helped create a more just society. Emma Catherine Whitmore had found her true calling, not just as a healer of bodies, but as a builder of communities where healing could flourish. The storm had passed, the seeds had been planted, and the harvest was more abundant than anyone could have imagined. The legacy would continue, carried forward by the children who were growing up in schools that taught both literacy and justice, by the families who had learned that collective action could triumph over corporate power, and by the communities that had discovered their own strength through the example of people who chose principle over profit. Some storms, Emma had learned, weren't disasters to be endured. They were opportunities to plant the seeds of transformation that would bloom for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.